It was supposed to be a routine day at the office for Susan, but as she stepped out of the elevator and headed towards her desk, she knew something was off. The hushed whispers and sidelong glances were a clear indication that the office gossip mill had been churning. Susan's heart sank as she spotted Karen, her coworker and self-proclaimed office manager, marching straight towards her with a scowl on her face. Karen's icy demeanor and clenched fists immediately put Susan on edge. "Susan, can I see you in the conference room?" "Now," Karen demanded, her voice dripping with barely contained rage. Confused and unsettled, Susan followed Karen, trying to rack her brain for any wrongdoing on her part. As they entered the conference room, Karen slammed the door behind them, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent office. "What is the meaning of this?" Susan asked, her voice trembling slightly. Karen paced the room, her manicured nails tapping against the polished wood table. "I've been hearing some troubling things about you, Susan. Apparently, you've been gossiping about me behind my back." Susan's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? That's not true at all. I would never." "Save it," Karen snapped, cutting her off. "I have it on good authority that you've been spreading lies and rumors about me. Well, I won't stand for it. This kind of behavior is unacceptable, and I'm going to make sure you pay for it." Panic began to set in as Susan realized the gravity of the situation. Karen's reputation as the office tyrant was well known, and she had no doubt that the woman would stop at nothing to get her way. "Karen, I can assure you that I've done no such thing," Susan pleaded, trying to reason with her. "I'm sure this is all just a misunderstanding." But Karen was having none of it. "I don't care what you say, Susan. I'm going to make sure you're punished for this. In fact, I'm going to speak to the CEO and get you fired. We can't have someone like you working here, undermining me and causing problems." Susan's stomach twisted in knots as the realization hit her. Karen was serious, and she was willing to go to extreme lengths to get her way. This wasn't just a petty office squabble, it was a fight for her livelihood. Desperate, Susan tried a different approach. "Karen, please, let's talk this through. I'm sure we can find a way to resolve this issue without taking such drastic measures." But Karen's eyes had a wild, determined glint in them. "It's too late for that, Susan. You should have thought about the consequences before you decided to betray me." With those parting words, Karen stormed out of the conference room, leaving a shaken and terrified Susan in her wake. Susan knew she had to act fast if she wanted to save her job and her reputation. The battle lines had been drawn, and she was determined to fight back against Karen's relentless onslaught. Susan's mind raced as she hurried to her desk, her hands trembling. She had to think of a way to get ahead of Karen's accusations before the CEO got involved. Frantically, she pulled up the company directory and searched for the CEO's contact information. Just as she was about to hit send on an email, the office doors burst open, and the CEO, an imposing figure with a stern expression, strode in. All eyes turned to him as he made his way towards the conference room, where Karen was waiting. Susan's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the exchange through the glass walls. Karen's animated gestures and the CEO's furrowed brow only fueled her growing dread. This was it. Her career was about to come crashing down. Moments later, the CEO emerged from the conference room, his expression unreadable. Susan braced herself for the worst as he approached her desk. "Susan, can I see you in my office?" he said, his voice calm and measured. Swallowing hard, Susan followed the CEO, her mind racing with possible scenarios. Was she about to be fired? Would she be escorted out of the building in disgrace? Once inside the office, the CEO gestured for her to take a seat. "Susan, I've just had a very interesting conversation with Karen. She seems to believe that you've been spreading rumors and undermining her work." Susan opened her mouth to defend herself, but the CEO raised his hand, silencing her. "However, I've also been made aware of some concerning behavior on Karen's part. Apparently, she has a history of bullying and intimidating her coworkers." Susan blinked, stunned by this revelation. She had always known Karen to be difficult, but this was beyond anything she had expected. The CEO continued, "I've been monitoring the situation for some time, and I'm not pleased with what I've seen. Karen's actions have been detrimental to the morale and productivity of this office, and I simply won't tolerate it anymore." A glimmer of hope flickered in Susan's chest. "So, what does this mean for me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The CEO leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It means, Susan, that I'm not going to take any disciplinary action against you. In fact, I'd like you to continue doing your job to the best of your ability. As for Karen," his expression darkened, "I'll be having a very serious conversation with her about her behavior. If she continues to create a hostile work environment, I won't hesitate to take further action." Relief flooded through Susan, and she let out a shaky breath. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate your understanding." The CEO nodded. "Just keep doing what you're doing, Susan. And if you ever have any concerns, please don't hesitate to bring them to my attention." As Susan left the CEO's office, she felt a newfound sense of determination. Karen's reign of terror was about to come to an end, and she couldn't wait to see the look on the woman's face when she realized her plan had backfired. Susan returned to her desk, her heart still racing from the exchange with the CEO. She couldn't believe her luck. Karen's attempt to get her fired had not only failed, but it had also put the spotlight on the office tyrant's own unacceptable behavior. As she sat down, Susan noticed that the office had grown eerily silent. All eyes were on her, and she could feel the tension in the air. Clearly, word of the confrontation had spread like wildfire. Steeling herself, Susan decided to take the initiative. She stood up and cleared her throat, drawing the attention of her coworkers. "Everyone, I have something to say," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I know there have been rumors circulating about me, and I want to set the record straight. Karen has been spreading lies and trying to get me fired, but the CEO is aware of her behavior and is taking action." A collective gasp rippled through the office. Susan could see the surprise and relief on her coworkers' faces. They had been living under Karen's tyrannical rule for far too long, and the prospect of change was both exciting and daunting. "I want you all to know that I have done nothing wrong," Susan continued, her confidence growing. "I am committed to my work and to this company, and I will not let Karen's underhanded tactics bring me down. If any of you have been affected by her bullying, I encourage you to speak up and let the CEO know." The office erupted in a flurry of whispers and murmurs, as her coworkers began to share their own experiences with Karen's abusive behavior. Susan could see the resolve in their eyes. They were ready to stand up and fight back. Just then, the conference room door burst open, and a furious Karen emerged. Her face was flushed with rage, and her eyes were wild with desperation. "What is the meaning of this?" she spat, her gaze fixed on Susan. "How dare you undermine me in front of everyone?" Susan steeled her nerves and met Karen's glare head-on. "I'm not the one undermining anyone, Karen. You've been the one creating a hostile work environment and trying to get me fired for no reason. The CEO is aware of your behavior, and he's not happy about it." Karen's face paled, and she opened and closed her mouth several times, searching for a response. The realization that her plan had backfired was slowly dawning on her. "You can't do this to me," she cried, her voice shrill and panicked. "I'm the one in charge here, and I won't let you or anyone else take that away from me." But Susan was done backing down. "I'm sorry, Karen, but your reign of terror is over. The CEO is going to make sure that you are held accountable for your actions, and if you continue to harass me or any of my coworkers, we won't hesitate to take this to the authorities." The office erupted in applause and cheers as Susan's coworkers rallied behind her. Karen stood there, her shoulders slumped in defeat, the realization that her power was slipping away finally sinking in. Susan knew that this was just the beginning of a long and arduous battle. but she was determined to see it through. Karen's days of unchecked control were over, and the office would finally be free from her tyrannical grip. The aftermath of Susan's confrontation with Karen was nothing short of chaos. Word of the office tyrant's underhanded tactics had spread like wildfire, and Susan's coworkers were emboldened to come forward with their own stories of abuse and intimidation. As the CEO continued his investigation, it became clear that Karen's reign of terror had lasted far too long. The once untouchable office manager was now the subject of intense scrutiny, and her carefully crafted facade of power and control was slowly unraveling. Susan watched with a mixture of satisfaction and trepidation as the events unfolded. While she was relieved to see Karen finally being held accountable, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of worry. After all, this was a woman who had seemingly gotten away with her abusive behavior for years, and she wasn't likely to go down without a fight. True to form, Karen did not take the mounting evidence and growing chorus of voices against her lying down. She became increasingly erratic and desperate, lashing out at anyone who dared to challenge her authority. One day, as Susan was preparing to leave the office, she overheard a heated exchange between Karen and the CEO. The normally composed executive was visibly shaken, his brow furrowed in a mix of frustration and concern. "This behavior is completely unacceptable, Karen," the CEO thundered, his voice echoing through the silent office. "I've given you multiple chances to change your ways, and you've only continued to abuse your power and mistreat your coworkers. I had no choice but to terminate your employment, effective immediately." Karen's face contorted with rage, her eyes wild and unfocused. "You can't do this to me," she shrieked, her voice cracking with desperation. "This company owes me everything. I built this place from the ground up, and you're just going to throw me out like yesterday's trash." The CEO remained steadfast, his expression hardening. "Your contributions are appreciated, Karen, but they do not excuse the toxic and abusive environment you've created. This company is about more than just one person. It's about fostering a healthy, productive, and supportive workplace for all of our employees. And you, quite frankly, have failed to uphold those values." Karen's shoulders slumped, her defiant posture crumbling as the realization set in that her reign was truly over. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out, her usual venomous retorts replaced by a stunned silence. As security escorted the now former office manager out of the building, Susan couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over her. The nightmare was finally coming to an end, and the office could begin to heal from the scars left by Karen's abuse. But even as Karen disappeared from view, Susan couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that this was not the end of the story. After all, a woman like Karen, who had wielded so much power for so long, was not likely to go down without a fight. In the weeks following Karen's termination, the office atmosphere seemed to shift palpably. The once pervasive sense of fear and tension had been replaced by a cautious optimism, as Susan and her coworkers began to slowly rebuild a sense of trust and camaraderie. However, the respite was short-lived. It quickly became clear that Karen was not going to go down without a fight. First, there were the angry phone calls and emails, with Karen hurling a litany of accusations and threats at the CEO and anyone else she deemed responsible for her downfall. She claimed that she was the victim of a vast conspiracy, orchestrated by Susan and her allies to undermine her authority and take control of the company. When these tactics failed to garner the desired response, Karen escalated her efforts, hiring a team of aggressive lawyers to pursue legal action against the company. She alleged wrongful termination, defamation, and a host of other charges, all in a desperate attempt to regain the power and influence she had lost. The office was plunged back into a state of unease and uncertainty as the legal battle dragged on. Susan found herself constantly on edge, worried that Karen's vindictive streak would ultimately prove to be her undoing. One day, as Susan was leaving the office, she noticed a familiar figure lurking in the shadows of the parking lot. Her heart racing, she quickened her pace, only to be confronted by Karen, Her eyes narrowed, and her lips twisted into a malicious grin. "Well, well, if it isn't little Susan," Karen sneered, her voice dripping with disdain. "I've been waiting for you." Susan felt a chill run down her spine, and she instinctively took a step back, her hand gripping her car door handle. "What do you want, Karen?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What do I want?" Karen echoed, her laughter devoid of any hint of mirth. "I want my life back, Susan. I want my job, my power, my respect, and I'm not going to stop until I get it." Susan swallowed hard, her mind racing to find a way out of this confrontation. "Karen, this has gone too far. You need to let it go and move on. Nothing good will come from this." But Karen's expression only darkened, her eyes glinting with a dangerous intensity. "Oh, I'm just getting started, Susan. And you and your little band of traitors are going to pay for what you've done to me." Before Susan could react, Karen lunged forward, her hands outstretched as if to grab her. Instinctively, Susan reached for her car door, fumbling to unlock it as she backed away. In the distance, she could hear the sound of footsteps and voices, as a nearby security guard and a few of her coworkers rushed to her aid. Karen, realizing she had been caught, quickly retreated, her expression twisted with a mixture of rage and desperation. As Susan watched Karen disappear into the night, she felt a chill of dread settle in the pit of her stomach. This was no longer just a battle for her job and her reputation. It had become a fight for her very safety. In the aftermath of the confrontation in the parking lot, the office was thrown into a state of heightened tension and fear. Word of Karen's threatening behavior quickly spread, and Susan found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, wondering when the former office manager might strike again. The legal battle continued to rage on, with Karen's lawyers aggressively pursuing their case against the company. Despite the CEO's best efforts to downplay the situation and assure his employees of their safety, the constant barrage of threats and legal filings only served to exacerbate the already tense atmosphere. Susan, feeling increasingly isolated and vulnerable, began to consider her options. She knew that she couldn't continue living in fear, constantly looking over her shoulder and worrying about what Karen might do next. But the thought of abandoning her job and her colleagues, who had rallied behind her in the fight against their former tormentor, was almost too much to bear. One day, as Susan was poring over the latest legal documents, a spark of an idea began to take shape in her mind. She remembered the CEO's words about how Karen's actions had been detrimental to the company's morale and productivity. What if there was a way to turn the tables on her former coworker, to use her own desperation against her? Filled with a newfound sense of determination, Susan set to work, meticulously combing through the evidence and building her case. She reached out to her colleagues, gathering their statements and testimonies, weaving a narrative that painted a clear picture of Karen's abusive behavior and its impact on the company. As she put the finishing touches on her presentation, Susan couldn't help but feel a twinge of trepidation. She knew that this was a high-stakes gamble, one that could either completely unravel Karen's legal strategy or backfire spectacularly. But she was out of options. It was time to take the fight directly to her former coworker. With a deep breath, Susan marched into the CEO's office, her eyes burning with a fierce resolve. "Sir, I believe I have a way to put an end to this entire situation," she said, her voice steady and confident. The CEO leaned forward, his expression a mix of curiosity and cautious optimism. "I'm listening, Susan." "I've been doing some digging, and I've uncovered some very interesting information about Karen's past," Susan began, her fingers trembling slightly as she handed over the stack of documents. "It seems that she has a history of similar abusive behavior at her previous employers, and there are even a few lawsuits on record." The CEO's brow furrowed as he studied the documents, his expression darkening with each passing moment. "This is quite damning," he murmured, his gaze meeting Susan's. "What are you proposing?" "Sir, I think we should take this information to Karen's legal team," Susan said, her voice barely above a whisper. Let them know that we have evidence of a pattern of behavior, and that we're willing to countersue for the damage she's done to the company's reputation and morale. The CEO nodded slowly, a glimmer of understanding dawning in his eyes. It's a bold move, Susan, but I think you might be onto something. If we can turn the tables on Karen and make her the one on the defensive, it could be the key to finally putting an end to this nightmare. Susan felt a surge of hope, but she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that this was a risky gambit, one that could either secure their victory or seal their downfall. The decision to take the fight directly to Karen's legal team was a bold and risky one, but Susan couldn't shake the feeling that it was their best chance at finally putting an end to the office tyrant's reign of terror. As she sat across the table from Karen's high-powered attorneys, Susan felt a familiar sense of trepidation. These were seasoned professionals, well-versed in the art of legal maneuvering, and she knew that they would stop at nothing to protect their clients' interests. But Susan was not alone. Flanked by the CEO and a team of the company's own legal experts, she felt a newfound sense of confidence. They had a solid case, built on a mountain of evidence that painted a clear picture of Karen's abusive behavior and its far-reaching consequences. Let's cut to the chase, the lead attorney, a stern-faced woman with a steely gaze, began. Your client has made some rather serious allegations against our client, and we're here to put an end to this nonsense once and for all. Susan took a deep breath, her eyes meeting the attorney's. That's exactly why we're here, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. We're not here to continue this endless back and forth. We're here to present you with the facts and to make you an offer that you and your client can't refuse. The attorney's brow furrowed, and she exchanged a quick glance with her colleagues. We're listening. Susan slid a thick folder across the table, its contents neatly organized and clearly labeled. This is a comprehensive dossier outlining our case against Karen. It includes witness statements, HR records, and even evidence of a pattern of similar behavior at her previous places of employment. The attorneys leafed through the documents, their expressions growing increasingly grim. Susan could see the realization dawning on their faces. Their client's case was on shaky ground, and the tide was turning against them. What exactly are you proposing? The lead attorney asked, her voice tinged with a hint of unease. We're willing to drop all charges against Karen, Susan said, her gaze unwavering. In exchange, she agrees to a non-disclosure agreement, a severance package, and a permanent ban from ever setting foot in this company again. The attorneys exchanged a series of hushed whispers, their brows furrowed in deep concentration. Susan could feel the tension in the room thickening as the gravity of the situation sank in. Finally, the lead attorney cleared her throat, her expression guarded. This is an interesting offer. We'll need to discuss it with our client, of course. But I must say, you've certainly presented us with a compelling case. Susan nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. I have every confidence that you'll see the wisdom in this proposal. After all, it's in everyone's best interest to put an end to this ordeal. As the attorneys gathered their documents and prepared to depart, Susan felt a sense of cautious optimism. They had taken a significant risk in this gambit, but if it paid off, it would mean the end of Karen's reign of terror and the beginning of a new chapter for the beleaguered office. The days that followed the meeting with Karen's legal team were filled with a tense, uneasy silence. Susan and her colleagues waited with bated breath, unsure of whether their bold gambit had paid off, or if they were about to face the full brunt of Karen's wrath. As the hours ticked by, the CEO kept a watchful eye on the situation, ready to intervene if necessary. Susan, meanwhile, found herself constantly on edge, jumping at the slightest sound or unexpected movement. Then, just as she was beginning to lose hope, the call came. Karen's lawyers had accepted the proposal. The office erupted in a collective sigh of relief, the tension finally dissipating as the realization sank in that the nightmare was finally over. But as Susan and her colleagues celebrated their victory, a nagging doubt began to creep into her mind. Had they truly seen the last of Karen, or was this merely the calm before the storm? Her answer came sooner than she expected. Just a few weeks later, as Susan was scrolling through her social media feed during her lunch break, a headline caught her eye. Former office manager arrested for embezzlement and fraud. Intrigued, she clicked on the link, her eyes widening as she read the details of the story. Apparently, Karen's desperate gambit to reclaim her power had backfired spectacularly. In a last-ditch effort to undermine the company, she had been secretly siphoning funds and falsifying records, all in a twisted attempt to bring the organization crashing down around her. But the plan had unraveled when one of Karen's former coworkers, feeling guilty about their complicity in her abusive behavior, had come forward with information. The authorities had quickly traced the financial irregularities back to Karen, and she now found herself facing a slew of criminal charges. As Susan watched the surveillance footage of Karen being escorted out of her home in handcuffs, a sense of grim satisfaction washed over her. The tables had well and truly turned, and Karen's desperate attempt to regain control had only served to seal her own downfall. In the end, the office tyrant's reign of terror had come to a dramatic and fitting conclusion. Karen's own greed and vindictiveness had been her undoing, and Susan couldn't help but feel a twinge of poetic justice in the outcome. As the news spread through the office, Susan's coworkers couldn't help but exchange relieved and triumphant glances. The nightmare was finally over, and they could now focus on rebuilding and moving forward, free from the shadow of Karen's abusive behavior. For Susan, it was a bittersweet victory. While she was grateful to finally be rid of the office tyrant, the scars of the ordeal would likely never fully heal. But as she looked around at her colleagues, their eyes shining with a newfound sense of hope and determination, she knew that they had weathered the storm together and emerged stronger for it.